There's shepherds here in the story, and God has these angels announce the birth of Jesus to shepherds. And that's actually not insignificant, kind of a big deal. There's something to that. I realize we're a little disconnected from shepherds and sheep and shepherdness. We learned a little bit more about them in the Psalm 23 series. But shepherding is actually one of the oldest professions on the planet that people have done for a job. Not a whole lot today, not a lot of shepherds, at least not a whole lot in San Diego, barely in the U.S. We're not really familiar with sheep and sheep stuff. We know about Dolly, the cloned sheep, but when it comes to sheep and shepherding, we don't know a whole lot. Sheep, they're still widely used for wool, meat, and cheese. Sorry if you're vegan, that weirds you out, but you can be glad. Actually, only 1% of sheep produce comes from California, so we're pretty good on that if you don't like people eating sheep. Shepherding's pretty disconnected from us, but even the shepherding that happens today is really different than what we're reading in the Bible here. Today, if you're going to be a shepherd and you're going to make a living at, you usually got to have a flock of at least 500 sheep or something like that in a farm. It's pretty crazy. Really different than the kind of shepherding that goes on and went on in Bible times. And we pick that up in our text where it says that they were out in the field keeping watch over their flock at night. Shepherds in Bible times, they're with the sheep all the time, day in, day out, all through the night. Any of you ever worked a graveyard shift? How fun does that sound, working through the night and then outside? That doesn't sound too great. I wouldn't be too into that. Shepherding, it was a pretty low-scale job. It's a dirty job. You're out in the field and dirt and rocks and the animals and the dung and all of that. So shepherds, they were actually considered ceremonially unclean for Jews, and so they weren't allowed to take apart a lot of the Jewish rituals just for the simple fact that because they were shepherds. They were considered peasants. They're poor. Shepherds weren't even allowed to give a testimony in court because shepherds are just wacky. You can never trust a shepherd. So you got to think when you're thinking shepherd and shepherding, it's a really low scale job, kind of one of the lowest of the lows. So I don't know what would be the equivalent today, but maybe working at McDonald's or Jack in the Box or something. Sorry if you work at McDonald's or Jack in the Box, but we actually, you might notice that we have a lot of Jack in the Boxes in San Diego because they started here. So that's kind of fun information. True story. When I was 15, I got my work permit, and I was so excited about finally making money that I went out and got the first job that I could get, and I actually worked at McDonald's when I was 15. I worked there for 8 months, and in 8 months' time, I had been there longer than almost everyone except the manager. And it was fun. It was good for me. Now, I'd still work there again. I'll do any job that it takes to provide for my family. I promised Amy's dad when I asked her if I could ask him if I could marry her that I would always have a job. But fast food, it's kind of low scale. I've never heard anybody. It's a low scale job, right? Be when I grow up, I just really want to work at a fast food restaurant. That's my goal in life. And that gets us a little bit into shepherding, what shepherding was. If you're a shepherd in the Bible, it's this lower class of society that you belong to thing. You're kind of seen as secondary or less than. Now, in San Diego, we've got a pretty thick Catholicism base, especially in our Mexican population. That's because in the 16th century, when the Spaniards went into Mexico, they brought Catholicism and Christianity with them. But there was always kind of this sense among the Mexicans that they were less than, and they were other than the European Spaniards that had come in. So the story goes that just north of Mexico City, and I think it's the Tepeyac Hill, the Catholic priest, Juan Diego, where San Diego gets his name, he saw this vision of the Virgin Mary who asked him to build a church. And so in response to that, he said, well, what will be the sign? And she says to go get some flowers. And so he goes and gathers a bunch of roses and wraps them in a cloth. And somehow, supposedly, magically, this miracle took place where then her imprint was branded onto the cloth. And from that point on, this sign became known as the Virgin of Guadalupe, which means brown-skinned virgin. My buddy Noé, who was born in Oaxaca, Mexico, he tells me that the Virgin of Guadalupe is actually a really big deal for Mexican people, for a lot of Mexicans. They feel it's the direct thing that God gave to them to say that they weren't less than, but they were especially loved and accepted by God. And I'll tell you what, there's Mexicans, they know what it feels like to feel a lot of the secondary or second class. And that's kind of like shepherds. It's a big deal here in the story that angels show up and they announce the birth of God's Son, the creator of the universe, to shepherds. To shepherds. I mean, he's the most important person that's ever been born, and it's announced to shepherds. Poor, dirty, pathetic, outcast, lowly shepherds. God, I mean, you think about it, he had at his command all kinds of reliable witnesses. I mean, it might have seemed like it would make much more sense to have his birth announced to say like a king, because then the king tells people that everybody's going to believe the king. But no, he has it announced to shepherds. Why? Why did God do it this way? One reason I think is that God just loves to do things like this. It's just kind of what God does. Paul, the Apostle Paul, he wrote 2/3 in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 27, it says that God chose the foolish things in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. See, God loves to do like the upside down thing, the thing that you don't expect, and has really significant, good, and wonderful reasons for it. Jesus' birth is announced to shepherds. Jesus, he's born in a manger, a feeding trough for animals. I mean, essentially like a dog dish. And then Jesus, he lives in as this poor carpenter in this poor family. He starts his ministry and teaching and preaching, and he selects these original 12 disciples, and most of them were fishermen, another low-class type of people, low-class, lowly group, fishermen. Jesus, then when he starts his preaching and teaching ministry, he spends a lot of times with a bunch of other kinds of outcasts, like leopards and prostitutes and thieves and drunks. You see, God loves to do things kind of the upside down way, to choose the foolish things of the world, to shame the strong. Really, it teaches us that Jesus, he loves people that the world tends to look down on.